Imagine being trapped in a room where light is outlawed, and every whisper of truth is silenced. That was my world. I served darkness. I was trained to manipulate, to destroy, to deceive, and I saw things most Christians wouldn't dare believe. But in all the rituals, curses, and demonic pacts, there was one thing we feared more than holy water, more than church services, more than worship. It was a spiritual weapon hidden, neglected, and almost forgotten by many churches. That weapon was fasting. My name isn't important. What matters is what I've seen and what I'm about to tell you. For 15 years, I walked in shadows so deep that most believers would tremble at the mention of what I witnessed. I participated in rituals that would make your blood run cold. I cast spells that destroyed families, marriages, and ministries. I was initiated into levels of darkness that few ever reach, and fewer still ever escape from. But here's what will shake you to your core. In all those years of serving evil, studying the occult, and wielding supernatural power for destruction, there was one thing, just one, that could stop us dead in our tracks. It wasn't the cross hanging on your wall. It wasn't the Bible verses you quote. It wasn't even the name of Jesus spoken casually in conversation. It was when a true believer began to fast with genuine faith and desperate hunger for God. Chapter 1. The Dark Realm's Fear. Why Demons Dread Biblical Fasting. Let me paint you a picture of something most Christians have never seen. In the spiritual realm, demonic activity looks like a vast network of dark threads connecting people, places, and purposes. These threads pulse with assignment sickness here, depression there, addiction over there, broken relationships everywhere. The enemy's kingdom operates like a well-oiled machine, and most believers walk through life completely unaware of the supernatural war raging around them. But when someone begins a genuine biblical fast, not just skipping lunch to lose weight, but truly seeking God with desperation, something extraordinary happens. Those dark threads begin to snap. One by one, like guitar strings breaking under pressure, the enemy's assignments start falling apart. I remember the first time I witnessed this. We were working on a particular family, a pastor's family, actually. 3 generations of ministry, and we had been systematically destroying them through generational curses, financial attacks, and marital discord. The operation was going perfectly. The grandfather had already fallen into financial scandal. The father was struggling with hidden addiction. The son was rebelling against everything his family stood for. Then the grandmother started fasting. Not the kind of fasting you see in most churches today, the casual, comfortable kind where people give up chocolate for a week and call it spiritual discipline. This was the real thing. She locked herself in a room with nothing but water and her Bible. She prayed with tears. She sought God like her family's life depended on it, because it did. Within 48 hours, our entire operation began to crumble. The spiritual contracts we had in place started breaking. The curses we had spoken began reversing. The demons we had assigned to that family were being recalled not by us, but by a higher authority that we couldn't override. In the occult world, we called this the white fire phenomenon. When someone fasts with genuine faith and desperate hunger for God, they create what we experienced as white fire in the spiritual realm. This fire burns through demonic assignments like nothing else can. It's not just prayer, though prayer is powerful. It's not just worship, though worship is beautiful. It's the combination of physical denial and spiritual hunger that creates a unique spiritual frequency that literally makes demons flee. Chapter 2. What the Church Won't Preach. The Costly Power of Real Fasting. Here's what broke my heart when I first started attending church after my conversion. They barely mentioned fasting. And when they did, it was watered down, sanitized, and stripped of all its real power. Why? Because real fasting is costly. It's uncomfortable. It's inconvenient. And it exposes the difference between those who merely attend church and those who truly hunger for God. The modern church has become comfortable with comfortable Christianity. We've created a version of faith that fits neatly into our schedules, doesn't disrupt our appetites, and doesn't require the kind of sacrifice that actually moves heaven and shakes hell. But the enemy loves this version of Christianity. He's not threatened by believers who pray pretty prayers and sing lovely songs, but never deny themselves anything significant for the sake of spiritual breakthrough. I spent years in the occult studying religious institutions. We had detailed reports on which churches were actually dangerous to our operations and which ones we could safely ignore. Want to know the difference? The dangerous churches were the ones where believers fasted regularly, desperately, and with genuine faith. The safe churches were the ones where fasting was either never mentioned or treated as an optional spiritual discipline for the super spiritual people. The truth is, most pastors avoid teaching about fasting because it reveals the spiritual condition of their congregation. When you call people to fast, you quickly discover who is genuinely hungry for God and who is just going through the motions. It's easier to preach about love, grace, and prosperity than it is to challenge people to deny their flesh for the sake of spiritual power. But here's what those pastors don't understand. By avoiding this topic, they're leaving their congregations defenseless against spiritual attacks that can only be broken through prayer and fasting. They're keeping their people in spiritual infancy, when they should be raising up warriors who can bind and loose in the heavenly realms. Chapter 3. From Witchcraft to Worship. How one fast crushed a lifetime of darkness. My own turning point came through fasting, though I didn't know it at the time. After 15 years in the occult, I was at the pinnacle of spiritual power from the wrong side. I had authority over demons, could cast spells that would manifest physically, and was being groomed for even higher levels of initiation. But I was also dying inside. The darkness I served was consuming me. The power I wielded was destroying my soul. I was trapped in a spiritual prison with no way out, because in the occult, there is no retirement plan. You serve until you die, or until you're killed for trying to leave. But there was a woman in my neighborhood who had been praying for me for 3 years. I found out later that she had been doing something I had never encountered before. She would fast for 3 days every month specifically for my salvation. Not just praying fasting, denying herself food and spending those days in intense intercession for my soul. I began to notice strange things happening. The demons that usually responded to my commands began hesitating. The spells I cast began backfiring. The spiritual protection I had enjoyed for years began weakening. At first, I thought it was just spiritual warfare from other occult practitioners. But then I started having dreams. In these dreams, I saw light. Not the harsh, blinding light that we associated with enemy attacks, but a warm, inviting light that somehow made me feel safe. I began to hunger for something I couldn't name. I started questioning everything I had believed and practiced for 15 years. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night. I was alone in my apartment, and suddenly I felt compelled to do something I had never done before. I knelt down and spoke to the God I had been taught to hate. I didn't even know how to pray properly, but I said something like, "God, if you're real, and if you're stronger than what I've been serving, prove it." What happened next changed everything. I felt the presence of God fill that room like nothing I had ever experienced. But more than that, I felt every spiritual chain that had bound me for 15 years break simultaneously. Every curse that had been spoken over me reversed. Every demon that had been assigned to me fled. I was free. Later, I learned that this was the exact night that woman had been fasting and praying for me. She had been led to extend her normal 3-day fast to 7 days. And on that 7th day, she had spent the entire day crying out to God for my salvation. Her fasting had created a spiritual breakthrough that 15 years of occult power couldn't resist. Chapter 4. Spiritual contracts broken. The invisible war behind the fast. Most Christians have no idea that there's a complex legal system in the spiritual realm. The enemy doesn't just attack randomly. He operates through legal rights and spiritual contracts. When someone sins, rebels against God, or participates in occult practices, they give the enemy legal grounds to afflict them. These spiritual contracts are real, binding, and can affect multiple generations. But here's what the enemy doesn't want you to know. Biblical fasting has the power to break these contracts. When someone fasts with genuine faith and repentance, they're not just denying their flesh, they're making a legal declaration in the spiritual realm that they're rejecting the enemy's authority and submitting to God's authority. I watched this happen countless times from the dark side. We would have solid spiritual contracts on individuals or families, legal rights that had been established through generational sin, personal rebellion, or occult involvement. These contracts gave us authority to bring sickness, financial destruction, relational chaos, and spiritual oppression. As long as these contracts remained in place, we could operate with impunity. But when someone began to fast with genuine desperation for God, those contracts began to dissolve. The fasting created a spiritual frequency that literally rewrote the legal documents in the spiritual realm. Rights that had been granted to the enemy were revoked. Doors that had been opened to darkness were slammed shut. Assignments that had been in place for decades were suddenly canceled. The most powerful example I witnessed was a man who had been struggling with addiction for 20 years. His grandfather had been involved in Freemasonry, which had opened doors to generational curses. His father had been an alcoholic, which had established patterns of addiction in the family line. The man himself had experimented with drugs in college, which had given us direct access to his mind and emotions. We had a rock-solid spiritual contract on this man. Multiple generations of legal rights. He had tried rehab, counseling, and medication, but nothing worked because the root of his problem was spiritual, not just psychological or physical. Then his wife began fasting for his deliverance. 7 days of water only, spending hours each day in prayer and worship. By the 3rd day, I watched as the spiritual contracts began to weaken. By the 5th day, they were starting to tear. By the 7th day, they were completely dissolved. The man was delivered instantly. 20 years of addiction broken in 7 days because his wife understood the spiritual laws that govern breakthrough. She didn't just pray, she fasted. She didn't just believe, she sacrificed. She didn't just hope, she warred. Chapter 5. Not all fasts are equal, the kind that frightens the enemy. Here's something that will surprise you. Not all fasting is created equal. In the occult world, we quickly learned to distinguish between different types of fasting and which ones we needed to take seriously. The fasting that didn't concern us was the casual, comfortable kind. People who gave up coffee for a week, or skipped dinner to spend more time in prayer, or participated in corporate fasts where they ate 1 meal a day and called it sacrifice. These fasts were spiritually ineffective because they didn't require genuine sacrifice or create the kind of spiritual hunger that moves heaven. But there were other kinds of fasting that sent shockwaves through the spiritual realm. These were the fasts that we feared, monitored, and tried desperately to break. The desperate fast. This was when someone fasted not as a spiritual discipline, but as a matter of spiritual life and death. They weren't fasting to get closer to God in general. They were fasting because they were fighting for something specific. A wayward child, a broken marriage, a terminal diagnosis, a financial crisis. These fasts carried an urgency and desperation that created powerful spiritual momentum. The Esther fast, 3 days and 3 nights without food or water, typically done when someone was facing a seemingly impossible situation. We learned to recognize these fasts immediately because they created what we called divine intervention. Openings, windows of time when God would move supernaturally to reverse circumstances that seemed unchangeable. The Daniel fast, extended periods of eating only vegetables and water while seeking God for revelation and breakthrough. These fasts were particularly dangerous to our operations because they often resulted in believers receiving supernatural insight into our strategies and assignments. The bride fast. This was when someone fasted not because they needed something from God, but because they wanted to be closer to Him. These fasts were motivated by love rather than desperation, and they created a spiritual intimacy that made it impossible for us to access that person's mind or emotions. The key difference wasn't the length of the fast or the specific food restrictions. The key difference was the heart motivation and the level of sacrifice involved. Fasting that didn't cost anything spiritually didn't accomplish anything spiritually. But fasting that involved real sacrifice, real hunger, and real desperation created spiritual power that could shatter demonic strongholds. Chapter 6. Church versus Kingdom. Why institutional religion keeps fasting surface level after my conversion. I spent years trying to understand why the church was so weak compared to what I had experienced in the occult. I had seen supernatural power manifested regularly in the kingdom of darkness, but in most churches, supernatural power was rare, sanitized, and often explained away. The answer became clear when I studied the early church and compared it to the modern church. The early believers fasted regularly, desperately, and with genuine faith. They understood that certain spiritual breakthroughs required more than just prayer. They required the kind of sacrifice that fasting represents. But somewhere along the way, the church became institutionalized. Instead of a movement of desperate believers seeking God's power, it became an organization focused on comfort, convenience, and crowd control. Fasting became inconvenient for church schedules. It was uncomfortable for church members. It was unpredictable for church programming. So the church began to water down the teaching on fasting. Instead of calling people to the kind of desperate, sacrificial fasting that breaks spiritual strongholds, they began promoting fasting that was barely different from going on a diet. They taught people to give up social media, or chocolate, or television, and called it spiritual discipline. This served the institutional church's purposes perfectly. It allowed them to check the fasting box without actually challenging their members to the kind of sacrifice that would reveal the spiritual condition of their hearts. It kept people comfortable while making them feel spiritual. It avoided the messages of real breakthrough, real deliverance, and real supernatural power. But this watered-down version of fasting serves the enemy's purposes too. It keeps believers weak, ineffective, and spiritually immature. It prevents them from accessing the spiritual power that God has made available to them. It maintains the status quo, where the church talks about spiritual warfare, but rarely engages in the kind of spiritual battles that actually change the spiritual atmosphere over families, communities, and nations. The truth is, most churches today would be uncomfortable with the kind of fasting that actually moves heaven and shakes hell. It would disrupt their programming, challenge their comfort, and reveal the difference between those who are genuinely hungry for God and those who are just going through the motions. Chapter 7. Fasting as a Weapon. How to use it like a warrior. Not a ritualist, if you've read this far, you're probably wondering, how do I fast in a way that actually creates spiritual breakthrough? How do I move beyond religious ritual into genuine spiritual warfare? First, understand that fasting is not about impressing God or earning His favor. God doesn't love you more when you fast, and He doesn't love you less when you don't. Fasting is a spiritual weapon, a tool that creates spiritual conditions for breakthrough that cannot be created any other way. Start with the right heart. Before you begin any fast, examine your heart motivation. Are you fasting because you're desperate for God to move in a specific situation? Are you fasting because you want to be closer to Him? Are you fasting because you recognize that some spiritual strongholds require more than prayer alone? If you're fasting to lose weight, impress others, or fulfill a religious obligation, you're missing the point. Choose your battle. Effective fasting is targeted fasting. Instead of fasting to get closer to God in general, fast for something specific: a wayward child, a broken marriage, a financial crisis, a health situation, a spiritual stronghold in your community. When you fast with a specific target, you create focused spiritual momentum that can break through specific barriers. Prepare for war. The enemy will fight your fast more than he fights your prayers. He knows that fasting creates spiritual power that can destroy his assignments. Expect physical discomfort, emotional upheaval, and spiritual attacks. This isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something right. Combine fasting with prayer. Fasting without prayer is just dieting. Prayer without fasting is often just wishful thinking. But fasting combined with prayer creates a spiritual frequency that moves heaven. Spend the time you would normally spend eating in prayer, worship, and studying God's Word. Don't advertise. Your fast. Jesus warned against fasting to be seen by others. The power of fasting comes from the secret place, not from public recognition. Keep your fast between you and God. Don't post about it on social media. Don't talk about it unless someone specifically asks for prayer support. Expect breakthrough. One of the biggest mistakes believers make is fasting without expectation. They fast hoping something might happen, rather than fasting with faith that something will happen. When you fast with genuine faith, you create spiritual momentum that must produce results. Chapter 8. Deliverance and Revelation. What I saw. When I tried it for the first time I fasted as a believer, I had no idea what I was doing. I had been a Christian for about 6 months, and I was still dealing with the spiritual aftermath of 15 years in the occult. I had been delivered from the major strongholds, but there were still areas of my life where I felt spiritually weak and vulnerable. A mature believer suggested that I try fasting for breakthrough in these areas. I decided to fast for 3 days, drinking only water and spending the time in prayer and Bible study. I had no idea what to expect, but I was desperate for complete freedom from my past. The first day was physically challenging, but spiritually peaceful. I felt closer to God than I had since my conversion. The second day was when things began to get interesting. I started having what I can only describe as spiritual visions, not hallucinations from hunger, but clear, vivid pictures of spiritual realities. I saw the remaining demonic assignments that were still attached to my life. I saw the spiritual strongholds that had been built during my years in the occult. I saw the areas where I still had spiritual contracts that needed to be broken. But I also saw something else. I saw the spiritual authority that God had given me as His child. And I saw how fasting was activating that authority in ways that normal prayer and Bible study couldn't. By the third day, I was experiencing what I can only describe as a spiritual battlefield. I could sense the enemy's attempts to break my fast, distract my focus, and maintain his remaining footholds in my life. But I could also sense the presence of God in a way that I had never experienced before. It was as if fasting had thinned the veil between the physical and spiritual realms, allowing me to perceive spiritual realities with unusual clarity. When I broke the fast on the evening of the third day, I knew something fundamental had changed. The spiritual oppression that had lingered from my occult past was gone. The fear and anxiety that had plagued me since my conversion were replaced with peace and confidence. The spiritual weakness that had made me vulnerable to the enemy's attacks was replaced with spiritual strength and authority. But the most significant change was in my relationship with God. Fasting had created a level of spiritual intimacy that I had never experienced before. I had moved beyond just knowing about God to actually knowing God. I had moved beyond just believing in spiritual power to actually experiencing spiritual power. Chapter 9. The Silence Ends Now. Calling Believers Back to Forgotten Fire. I'm writing this because I can't stay silent anymore. I've been a believer for over a decade now, and I've watched the church grow weaker and weaker while the enemy grows bolder and bolder. I've seen believers struggling with the same problems for years, praying the same prayers, attending the same services, and wondering why nothing changes. The answer is simple. We've forgotten how to war. We've forgotten the spiritual disciplines that create breakthrough. We've forgotten that some strongholds can only be broken through prayer and fasting. We've become comfortable with comfortable Christianity, and it's making us spiritually impotent. The enemy isn't threatened by believers who pray pretty prayers and attend church regularly, but never deny themselves anything significant for the sake of spiritual breakthrough. He's not worried about Christians who talk about spiritual warfare, but never engage in the kind of spiritual battles that actually change the spiritual atmosphere over families, communities, and nations. But he is terrified of believers who understand the power of biblical fasting. He knows that when God's people begin to fast with genuine faith and desperate hunger, his assignments begin to crumble. He knows that fasting creates spiritual power that can break generational curses, deliver the addicted, heal the sick, restore broken relationships, and transform entire communities. This is why he has worked so hard to keep the church ignorant about fasting. This is why he has promoted watered-down versions of fasting that are spiritually ineffective. This is why he has convinced so many believers that fasting is optional, outdated, or only for the super spiritual. But the truth is, fasting is one of the most powerful spiritual weapons that God has given to his people. It's a weapon that can break through spiritual barriers that have resisted years of prayer. It's a weapon that can create breakthroughs in situations that seem impossible. It's a weapon that can transform not just individual lives, but entire families, communities, and nations. The question is, will you use it? Will you move beyond comfortable Christianity into desperate faith? Will you deny yourself for the sake of spiritual breakthrough? Will you fast not just to get closer to God, but to see his power manifested in your life and in the lives of those you love? The enemy is hoping you won't. He's hoping you'll read this and think, that's interesting, but never act on it. He's hoping you'll find excuses for why fasting isn't for you, or why now isn't the right time, or why God understands your busy schedule. But I'm praying you'll do something different. I'm praying you'll recognize that we're in a spiritual war, and that war requires spiritual weapons. I'm praying you'll understand that some victories can only be won through sacrifice, and that fasting is the sacrifice that creates the kind of spiritual power that changes everything. The silence ends now. The comfortable Christianity ends now. The spiritual weakness ends now. It's time to fast. It's time to war. It's time to see the power of God manifested in ways that will shake the enemy's kingdom and transform God's people. The choice is yours, but remember, the enemy is watching, and he's hoping you'll choose comfort over breakthrough, convenience over power, and casual faith over desperate hunger. Don't give him what he wants. Give God what he deserves. Believers who are willing to sacrifice anything for the sake of his kingdom and his glory. The weapon is in your hands. The question is, will you use it? This testimony represents approximately 10 to 12 minutes of reading time at average speaking pace. The narrative combines personal experience with practical application, creating emotional engagement while providing actionable spiritual guidance for believers seeking breakthrough through biblical fasting.